Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the CreaTech stage at CogX Hybrid Festival 2021. Thank you so much for joining us. In case you are just tuning in, CogX is a global leadership summit and festival of AI and transformational technology addressing the big question, how do we get the next 10 years right? I'm Leila Siddiqui, Associate Director Diversity at the IPA and member of the Creative Industries Council Diversity Group, and I am your MC this afternoon. Over the last few days, CreaTech has had a stellar lineup of cutting-edge content from the sectors of gaming, live performance, advertising, fashion, music, esports, visual arts, and much, much more. It is worth reinstating that CreaTech is unique in that it is the intersection of creative and technology industries where innovation in AI, VR, algorithms, specialized softwares, and others are transforming creative services, outputs, and processes. CreaTech at CogX 2021 is hosted by the Creative Industries Council and supported by associate partners Kingston Smith, Digital Catapult, Facebook, and UKRI. Please do join in the conversation on social using hashtag CreaTechUK and hashtag CogX2021. You can find out more about the work of the Creative Industries Council and CreaTech at www.thecreativeindustries.co.uk. Right, so our next session is titled Tech versus Media Rules, Time for a Level Playing Field. This talk is aimed at exploring the changes in the TV and online video markets in relation to rules and regulation. Elizabeth Diaferia is our moderator. Elizabeth is Senior Advisor, Creative Industries Trade and Investment Board, working between government and industry to promote the creative industries. Elizabeth, over to you.
Thank you so much, Leila. And I'm thrilled this afternoon to, on this very, very hottest day of the year, steaming, and I'm streaming with hay fever. So please apologize if I nip off with a tissue. So I'd just like to welcome you this afternoon. We have two incredible people with so much experience in the TV and the broadcast area. David Wheeldon. David is the Group Director of Policy and the Head of Public Affairs at Sky TV. Before that, he was the Director of Sustainability and the Deputy at CSR at Sky. He's been there for about 15 years, I think, David. And he's also President of the Board of Directors of the Association of Commercial Television in Europe. What a title. And as well, another area which is key to what we're talking about today, he is on the Board of Directors on Internet Matters. Internet Matters is a non-profit helping to advise online safety for young people. So welcome, David. I'd love to see what comes out of this discussion today. I think it's very timely. And thank you. And our second person that's joining the discussion this afternoon is Ed Hall. So Ed is the managing partner of Expert Media Partners. Ed has got over 30 years experience in the TV and broadcasting industry. Oh my goodness, producing award-winning programs for BBC, ITV, Channel 4. He also has worked on the design of national terrestrial TV multiplex for the UK, and I think London Live, the TV station. And as well as that, goodness me, he is doing the EPG transactions. So Expert Media Partners developed the market, the UK market, for the sale and purchase of channel positions on the Sky digital network, as well as all your other television providers. Oh my goodness, Ed also was the founder of Comox UK for that was the local television network. So between you all, there is a lot of experience and a lot of work and a lot of knowledge that we need to go and share and discuss this afternoon. So obviously, tech versus media rules, time for a level playing field. Where do we start? I'm going to start with David, actually, and I'm going to say we're going to initially go straight into the online safety bill, the online harms bill that then became the online safety bill. As you know, it was published last month, and it will require internet platforms to report child sexual abuse as well as terrorist material identified on the services. So other online sectors and gatekeepers like the VPNs and sort of browsers are excluded from the provisions on this. Is it sustainable? Where do we go? What do you think?
Thank you, Elizabeth. That's a really interesting question. It sort of expands this way beyond TV straight away, because of course the debates about the responsibility of online platforms and of technology are really societal now. They go to the heart of the way we think about ourselves and the way that we think about how our society should be kept safe, and how individuals should be given the tools to keep safe. And I mean, I come at it with a TV background, although Sky is obviously a big technology company and an internet actor as well, having been an ISP since 2006, and in fact now the second largest by customer numbers in the UK, with also businesses in Ireland and Italy. So we kind of look at this quite holistically. And I think what's interesting about the debate that's going on, not just in the UK, but in Europe and indeed emerging in the US, about the way in which content moderation should take place online. This is content moderation, which of course has taken place on traditional media like television for decades, since the technology was established, pretty much. Is that there are big questions, not just about the responsibilities of the big global platforms that we all know about, the Facebooks and the Googles and the Twitters of this world, but also the whole of the internet value chain. And actually, as you're seeing technology changing, you're seeing the traditional if you like, regulated and responsible actors within that value chain. For example, internet service providers who traditionally have, if you like, had some control over the way that content was accessed online, being disintermediated by new technology, by new forms of browser technology. And the politicians are really struggling to keep up as they try to find new rules to impose on the whole of the value chain. They struggle to work out how to include them, because customers these days are deploying all sorts of means to get online, many of which just are not susceptible to the rules that are being invented. So you could, it's all very well to say we're going to impose some responsibilities on Facebook, but actually people are accessing content via browsers and VPNs, which aren't included within the remit of these new rules. So I think that's a really interesting question. And as a media business, we look at it and we sort of almost take the view that we're kind of finger in the dike moment. It feels like no one has really got a grip on how to bring some order to what a lot of people now feel is the Wild West. And that should concern a lot of us. And I think that's a huge issue of debate. So yeah, I think that's a challenging entry into this conversation.
No, I get that completely. I mean, when you think about all the different sort of like platforms, and certainly what's grown out over the years, everything from Instagram, and now we've got TikTok, and it's sort of like it's just getting bigger and bigger, and what will be happening next. Ed, I'd like to bring you into the discussion. And Ed, we've and I've known each other for many years actually, and I did some work with Ed back after the Brexit debate. So with Expert Media, when I was the head of Brexit policy, media policy, which was some time back, and Ed, we did a lot of work with the, oh my goodness, country of origin and Brexit, and where did it go? And what have you been working on since then? I mean, I know there's an awful lot which I read out of your bio, but equally, yeah. What are you up to for Expert Media? Where does it gone now since Brexit?
Thank you. I think you've obviously been quite lively on Google this afternoon, so thank you for that biography. I'd actually really like to start by picking up on something that David said, because I think that one element that's missing from this conversation that we often have about regulation of new platforms is sort of missing historically what the quid pro quo was between regulation and the ability to broadcast. So, in a world where we had a small number of broadcasters who had very valuable licenses, either licenses they'd paid for or licenses that they were awarded because of their PSB status. But those types of broadcast licenses that gave you access to millions of households came with a responsibility. So you had enormous commercial advantages as the commercial broadcasters right up until the 90s had by being one of those licensees. But in return, there were public goods that you were required to adhere to and to reflect in the way that you managed and ran your business and what you put on air. And I think as we've drifted from that into multi-channel, firstly multi-channel in an analog world with a limited number of channels, then into the digital space with an effectively uncapped number of channels, and then into the internet, is that not only is regulation also trying to catch up, but what it's also doing is, I think, failing to offer what is the advantage to someone to be regulated. And whilst in the early 90s, it was very obvious that being a Channel 5 had a very significant commercial advantage potentially, because it gave you that access as one of a limited number of channels to a lot of households. What the advantage is of being a compliant content handler now is rather more difficult to define. And I think, and I'm actually sitting in Greece where we have some clients at the moment, and I was sitting in a bar watching one of the football matches that we're all watching at the moment. And of course, it was being stolen via an IPTV provider who's providing a wide range of channels to a wide range of establishments. And we all know that that's happening. We all know that's part of the industry. And of course, people are also running around actively trying to stop that. But at the same time, the commercial advantage is clearly not to comply. And so when it comes to really important online harms and issues around advertising or protection of minors, you've now got this slight, I think, contrasting set of objectives, which is that in order to have the most commercial advantage, you need to find ways around a lot of these regulations, which is clearly what a lot of people are doing. And as we've gone away from imagining that we were moving towards a convergent world, actually now when we've called all our Apple boxes and our Now TV boxes and our Fire TV sticks and our streaming televisions and our connected devices, we've all found lots of ways to get content, not least VPN. Ways of escaping protection of content. So, whilst I think this is going to be a very interesting conversation, I think that at the core of this is that government and regulators, policymakers, need to sit down and think about how you begin to give some form of advantage or benefit to those people who are compliant broadcasters in the way that traditional television broadcasters benefited by taking on those additional public service obligations in the first case and more commercial regulation subsequently. And I think those two things, instead of coming together, have diverged very significantly. And I think therein lies a lot of the problems that we face.
Yeah, interesting. I think that also, I mean, what is so key is that we're looking at so many different things that's coming out of the government at the moment and the different regulation that is happening. And on the online side, that you just think that, looking on advertising, that, the watershed at 9 p.m. and what's going to happen with sort of junk food and where does that go? Because it's sort of like it's entering so many different areas. It's not just sort of like online safety, but it's sort of like the government message that's coming through. David, I think you might have been doing some work on that recently.
Yes, I'm just going to pick up on something that Ed said and then segue into that advertising point, because they're actually they're linked, I think. And that is, Ed talked about commercial advantage and rewarding it, or rather rewarding responsibility with some form of commercial advantage. And that, of course, was, if you like, the public service broadcaster compact in the UK for many decades. And the government is looking at that, and it is looking at the prominence rules and all the rest of it. Although I think that gets much more complicated in a connected device world, because there is a world of difference between a sort of dumb Samsung connected TV and Sky Q, which actually I don't think need the same form of regulation. But the real point about the rules around TV, it seems to me, wasn't historically about rewarding good behavior so much as recognizing the unique position that this medium played in society. because with limited spectrum, as you pointed out, Ed, you had limited number of broadcasters. So you had gatekeepers. You had gatekeepers to information. And if you're going to accept gatekeepers in society, you need to ensure that they are held to the very highest account. And what I think is so interesting about where we're at now is that everybody is recognizing that in the online world, you increasingly have gatekeepers. In fact, the European law that is being introduced and debated, talking about content moderation and the responsibility of platforms, 2 pieces of law, in fact, specifically refers to online gatekeepers. And I think that that new recognition that there is a set of rules and responsibilities that those gatekeepers need to be held to is sort of inevitable, and indeed is the start of, I think we're just at the beginning of a journey which brings those rules in, both around obligations to moderate content, obligations to protect users and society, and obligations to behave responsibly towards other economic actors in the sector. And then that, interestingly, I think does bring one to advertising. And Elizabeth, you referred to the current looking government review that the government's got into unhealthy food and the 9 p.m. watershed. And TV has long been the medium that you choose to kind of aim your advertising rules at when you want to achieve a better societal outcome. And there are very strict rules around advertising, and broadcasters are liable for advertising that they carry on their channels. But what's interesting about where the current UK government review is that it's finally recognised that you can't simply put rules on TV if you want to achieve a societal outcome and not also look at online, because all you do is you drive audiences away from a medium that is responsible and regulated into one that isn't. And in fact, the trend anyway is for, particularly for younger audiences, to be eyeballs are going online. So for the first time, the government is proposing to bring in restrictions online. And I think that is absolutely inevitable and probably the right thing to do. It is, by the way, being met with howls of outrage from the online advertising community and the online platforms. But I'm afraid my sort of suggestion would be to them would be get used to it, because I cannot see the direction of travel being anything other than more rules and greater regulation. And in fact, I would ask the question why it is that some of the online platforms that make billions out of advertising are not held more legally responsible for the adverts that they carry. I think that eventually will be the next step.
Interesting. I think I totally agree with you, actually. Ed, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, because it comes to this fragmentation issue that I keep talking to clients about, who are, we deal with broadcast clients who are looking to regulate both on television and in new spaces, if we can still call them new spaces. But there was a point where we were thinking about a single market, and obviously the UK is no longer part of that. But nonetheless, even if we were, what we're seeing is different countries taking very different approaches to how their community, their politics feel they want to deal with the issues that we're discussing. So, you don't see a common approach. And actually, under the, when Television Without Frontiers became the AVMS directive, what we were seeing was the introduction or the expansion of what was almost genuinely a single market. There were differences in some countries, but in broadcasting, a broadcast license in one EU or EEA country was effectively a passport to broadcast in all others, with very few exceptions. And that was a very solid single market. But what we're seeing both in broadcasting and in the management of the advertising in online services is countries themselves wanting to regulate that advertising, some in terms of the sort of harms that we've been talking about, but in others actually solely on a commercial basis. I mean, Ireland, for example, has talked about implementing charges for for advertising that's in their country of reception in order to help fund their state broadcaster. Now, I'm not sure how far that idea will go, but it's there and it's on the political agenda, and it won't be the only country where that conversation takes place. So, once the country of reception of services, rather than the whole of the EU or the whole world, once the country of reception starts to address its concerns about, yes, online harm to minors, yes, tobacco advertising, yes, to violent content and the sharp end of this, but also actually to straightforward commercial advertising, and in a world where online streaming companies can use cookies and target directly individuals and individual households with advertising, whereas broadcasters still broadly can't. You again have this, when we're talking about level playing fields, we're still talking about an objective of regulation and objective of policymakers, which I think is quite different from the reality of what's happening on the ground.
No, it's very true, actually, and you brought in something I wanted to talk about, which is about sort of the digital single market, and sort of like when we think about it with all the everybody has got different rules, even though you're sort of all trying to come together to one thing, and obviously there are obviously some countries that are getting things better than others. David, is there something do you feel there's some countries that are sort of like jumping ahead of the UK on this, or what are your thoughts?
So there's two elements to the question now, which is who's taking the leadership position, but also what does it mean for the kind of the settled view of rules and regulation in the single market in Europe, putting Brexit aside, of course. I think what's quite interesting about what's happening in Europe, for those that don't know, the internet rules that are being brought in, which are twofold, really, one about content moderation on big online platforms, and another about the behavior of systemically important economic platforms, which together make a new sort of digital compact, is that the European Union is bringing those rules in part because individual countries have started to legislate in both of those areas on their own. So the Germans have a law called NetzDG, which is about removal of certain types of content in a certain period of time. The French have got a similar law. The Germans have also got a new law regulating the economic behavior of big online platforms as well. So the EU has been watching the fragmentation of the single market happening and is trying to bring it back together. But that creates some really big challenges for them, because for the first time, and I know I'm a sad policy wonk, I spend too much of my time following this stuff, and when I'm allowed to, too much of my time in Brussels and in other countries in Europe talking to politicians about it. But what you're seeing is, as the EU is proposing to bring these rules and harmonize these rules in the single market, to the very point that Ed was making earlier, a lot of countries are saying, well, hang on a minute. These are important to our society. We want some control. We want some determination about whether or not these rules are being followed and are fit for purpose. We don't want to allow them to be determined outside of our country, in the so-called country of origin idea, that where the service is located, that's where the regulation happens. And of course, they've had their fingers badly burnt on this with GDPR, because a lot of these internet platforms have gone and put themselves in Luxembourg and Ireland, where the regulation of data protection now happens for Facebook and etc. And many countries feel like those regulators are not doing and not implementing it the way they'd like to. So they're now saying to the European Commission, no, we want a piece of the action. We want some control. And of course, that raises some fundamental questions about the future of the single market and the way that these platforms are going to be regulated and overseen politically in these markets. And that's before you take into account Brexit, and it's before you take into account the fact that the Americans are going down a different direction. And I actually think, I posit this, and I'm sure it's very controversial and lots of people will disagree, but that we're probably, at the apogee of that moment where these platforms are truly global. And that actually from now on, we're going to see more and more fragmentation in the way that the platforms are forced to operate because of regulation.
Absolutely. I was looking yesterday, actually, India looking at the same thing, and I think there's, that it's not just going to be the EU. Obviously, America. You think about the whole global situation is it's bigger and bigger, isn't it? Ed, can I bring you in?
Yeah, I was going to say, because what that does is it brings us right back again to prominence. The way in which menus, the way in which front pages, the way in which home pages, whatever type of system you're on, but the way in which that content is made available to you is an enormously powerful tool. And so, if you look at the front of Netflix, or you look at the front of Amazon Prime, or you look at your Samsung TV, or you look at your Now TV box, the decisions that are made about what content's being launched, what's being profiled, what isn't, what's harder to find, what's tucked away. Those were conversations that on linear EPGs were had, and to some extent still continue. But in our regulated space in the UK, became certainly on the digital satellite, on the Sky platform, a matter of a commercial market. But and one in which Sky is a fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory player, and no one's ever actually, I think, suggested that they haven't acted in that way. But when you start to look at these online platforms, they're able to make a range of commercial decisions about which content is favoured. And when you start to look at some of the parts of the European Union, but other parts of the world too, where there are huge cultural divisions, language divisions, political tribal divisions. We do a lot of work in Nigeria. You can start to see why prominence isn't just about channel numbers. Prominence is about how you handle content, how available you make it, how visible you make it, and how you promote it. And at the moment, that's an area where I don't see the regulators stepping with, I think, enough authority, because I think some of the areas in which they're focused about country-receptive advertising and trying to levy for that is unhelpful and contradicts the spirit of the single market. Whereas actually saying, if you are going to have the power to identify which content I can see and when, and which content I'm likely to see and when, that is an enormously powerful tool, and that is one that really ought to be regulated.
Very interesting, and I agree that there's so much that this is such a big issue. We could go on for hours. It's really at the end of a day, so it's sort of like before we get the next session. One thing that's also the question that's come in is that let me just see here now. So the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, has recently warned it will take legal action against Google and social media companies if they continue to accept ads for online financial scams. Very true, actually. Should online platforms be held liable for adverts like TV companies are? Who wants to go first?
My simple answer to that question is yes. But I mean, look, I think it's fascinating. I think the executive director of the FCA said before the British Parliament yesterday that he was pretty fed up with the fact that the FCA is having to spend hundreds of millions of pounds taking out adverts on social media platforms to warn people about financial scams that are advertising on social media platforms. That cannot be right. And we have a system in this country where the ASA does regulate adverts online. And it's absolutely right to say that it's not a total free-for-all, and the ASA has taken some brilliant steps, I think, actually, in the last few years to bring its rules to bear on advertisers. But it remains the case that the platforms themselves don't bear the legal responsibility, but it's the platforms that are making the money. They're the ones that are monetizing. They're the ones that are applying the algorithms to make sure that you see the adverts that they think are going to be most valuable to you and to them. And I actually find it quite staggering that we've got to this point in the development of the internet advertising business model, and we haven't yet found a system to bring some rules to the way that platforms display advertising. But I don't think it'll be that long before that happens.
No, interesting. I think, you think about e-commerce actually, and it's sort of like, you only have to sort of Google something you might be even looking at, or even when you're driving in the car and you might be having a conversation, and then you get back and you'd go on your phone and you've suddenly seen that, you mentioned that you might fly to New York, and the next thing you've got an advert coming up for, British Airways or something. So it's not happening like that on our TV. So, there's so much where it's changing. Ed?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, we're that generation, if you like, of internet first timers, and because we have therefore this instinctive belief, I think, that to some is almost a political belief that it is a Wild West, and it should be a caveat emptor space where it's your decision to engage with those adverts. Of course, that's deeply unhelpful because we know that those adverts that are misleading are most likely to be seen by or acted upon by people who are affected by them, or who are likely, who are vulnerable to those advertising techniques, and not to those of us who like to think that we're smart enough to spot them. And so, in television, you would never in 1,000 years be able to run those adverts. And if you did run them, you'd be held accountable for the harm that you caused. How you begin to get that addressed in advertising on the internet is a very big question, but it's one that isn't, I think, as difficult as one might expect, because I think, as David was alluding to, there are large and established and mature businesses that drive this advertising. It isn't a Wild West industry. There are large companies serving most of those adverts.
Absolutely, and listen, there's an awful lot of talk, and you only have to look on Twitter this week of what's been happening with advertisers, and certainly with our new TV channel this week, that a number of them are pulling off. I don't know if either of you have had time to look at the new news channel that you put on. Well, you didn't put it on, Ed, but it's on the EPG system. So GB News, has it been something that's taken up any of your time?
Yeah, I mean, GB News is clearly having a few teething problems. Small broadcasters launching in a time of COVID. That's I think an inevitability, and it provides great amusement for those who want to see the humour in the clips that are doing the rounds on Twitter. But actually, what they've done is, I think, quite extraordinary in A, raising the money in very challenging times, and B, launching a channel that seeks within Ofcom rules to do something a little bit different and add a new voice to our national debate. And I don't see that that's a negative. And I hope they get the tech issue sorted out. Like I say, we had nothing to do with the tech side of it. But to have got those studios launched, up and running, technically spec'd, built during COVID and launched, politics and all those other questions that people want to ask aside, I think, a big round of applause. TV wasn't expecting 60 million quid, boost in the arm in the middle of COVID. So, all power to GB News for that.
Okay, sure. And I think what is interesting, I mean, obviously Sunday night, the launch at 164,000 viewers. I haven't seen the stats for the last few days, and I'm not going to say that. Well, actually, all right, I will say it was double that was on Sky News, but not many of us would watch Sky News at 8 o'clock on a Sunday evening. So I'm going to take that out because I absolutely love Sky News. So
I'm disappointed you should say that, Elizabeth. I'm a religious watcher of Sky News at 8 o'clock on a Sunday evening.
Actually, I do. I like the press preview and all the news, and I probably watch it all evening. So much to my family's dismay.
There's an interesting point here, though. I mean, look, I sworn a self-denying audience about GB News because I don't think it's right for one broadcaster to criticise another. Although we can all have opinions about set design, but I think what it shows is really interesting. As Ed says, it's a monumental effort to launch at this time, but it also tells you that linear TV isn't dead. And I've been going around to conferences, including to tech conferences when I'm allowed in, and saying, I know you're all obsessed with the internet. I know you're all obsessed with video on demand and Netflix, but you know what? Linear TV still has life in it. No one wants to watch catch-up sport. Actually, appointment to view remains a really important model, and the linear TV channels and the public service broadcasters have been pretty resilient. So I think you're going to see linear TV around for quite some time, albeit it's innovating and its advertising models are innovating. And of course, the kind of seamlessness with the way with which it's bound into its on-demand offer is on all the platforms is becoming just a factor of the industry. But Netflix hasn't got it all its own way. No,
I'm with you on that. Actually, I think there's also a lot of room for, it's whilst it's a news channel, it's more of a news magazine. It's not giving the news as a news bulletin. One thing actually is what used to be, I suppose, terminology as science fiction is now science fact. We've seen Elon Musk with, launching his SpaceX 60 satellites. Ed, I know there's something that you're working closely with, which is a tech platform, and CogX is all about technology. So I'm going to ask you what next. I think you're working on something which is like a Zoom for TV.
Well, yeah, replacement. I mean, it's a technology we spotted that we're interested in technologies that disrupt, not for the sake of disruption, but ones that provide things faster, better, cheaper is kind of the mantra of that part of our business. And this is a great technology that is a peer-to-peer video platform. So it works over the internet, a 200 data center national global network that enables you to get round-trip video from your studio to a guest on a device somewhere and back to the studio with a latency of about 200 milliseconds, and to do so incredibly cheaply. So that's
Wow.
Now when you look at what's happening with a variety, I won't name them, of video platforms that were never designed for a broadcast environment and are providing us again with humorous clips for Twitter, the Prime Minister failing when he's using it in Parliament, or guests coming into those Downing Street press conferences, or perhaps on some recently launched TV channels. You'll find that getting that right, getting that volume of video well managed in the cloud, and then being able to deliver it to the other end of whatever process you're talking about can take out all the latency that the machines in your gallery tend to add. And that's where a lot of the issues come from. So, synced tech, getting that video from A to B at high speed, that's called the Path Studio. Thank you very much for the opportunity to plug it, Elizabeth.
Sorry for the plug, everybody. And we're getting close to the end, so I've just been handed a reminder. But actually, one thing that happened this week has also been in the news is the Ofcom and the situation with the BBC and whether they should or shouldn't have carried on. And I know it was a UEFA feed for the football. If any of you were watching, I know, Ed, you don't like football and you weren't watching it, but what will happen more on this is sort of like, do you think that there'll be any follow through, or do you think that it's just an apology will suffice?
Live television and stuff happens, and sometimes it's unfortunate. Sometimes I think the best thing to do in live television when things happen is a way that you wouldn't have planned for, is to say sorry and move on. But I think it's a tough call to say that in that live environment, the individuals doing it did something wrong in some horrendous way in the way that people are being attacked on Twitter. These are ordinary TV people doing their jobs, and perhaps if it happened again, they'd do it differently.
I mean, it's interesting though. Looping right back to where we started, TV is being held up to a certain standard, but of course online you wouldn't even think twice before saying something like this. It's ironic. Twitter is being used to attack the broadcaster, and yet Twitter as a platform has an awful lot of stuff on it which is a million times more offensive and worse than that. So I think it is interesting, and so that leave you with this thought, which is, are we going to see a more equalization of standards and rules around online and broadcast, and will that equalize up or will it equalize down?
Interesting. I definitely the main thing is that he is okay and he's well, and please hopefully making a strong recovery, and that everything goes well. And I must admit, nobody wants to be blamed for being the BBC man, but actually, to be honest, they did as well as they could in the circumstances, then carrying on a conversation. So our conversation sadly has come to an end. I would love to go on more, and I think we might have to have a round 2 at the next CogX or something, or see where it goes in the next year. I wanted to get onto things like data, onto obviously NFTs, that you can sort of like put your art on your TV, what's going to be going on with further technology and rules and regulations around that, but that's for another day. And I'd love to say thank you so much from Greece and what looks like it could be a church, Ed. And
thank you.
Thank you very much. And also to David from, I think, your office in Skye. Thank you so much, both of you. And I'll hand you back over to Leila. Thank you. I've been Elizabeth Diaferia for CITIB, the Creative Industry Trade Investment Board. We're promoting the work and the exports with government and industry across the creative industries. And we're working with the CAC. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a great discussion, Elizabeth, Ed, and David. Lots of expert insight there on what is such a relevant and complex topic area. Our next session is at 6 p.m. Do join us then for the CreaTech finale.